What's going on, guys? It's Hank from Sprues and Brews, and today we're going to be getting down and dirty with some weathering techniques for 135 scale armor models. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Allied vehicles from the European theater of operations. Now, before we get into the tutorial, let's do a quick exercise. I'm going to show you 4 pictures of Churchill tanks from all over the ETO. Pay attention to the weathering on each vehicle and try and find similarities between all 4. This first image is of a Northern Irish unit in Italy in March of 1945. The second shot is a 6th Guards vehicle in the Netherlands in November of 1944. This third shot is a vehicle of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment participating in the Battle of Normandy in June of 1944. And finally, this beautiful colored shot is of the 51st Royal Tank Regiment in Italy in July of 1944. So one thing I notice when I look at reference photos and videos of armored fighting vehicles during World War II is how much dust accumulates on everything. If you think about one of these heavy vehicles on the move, marching for miles and miles across countrysides and dirt roads, they'd be kicking up a ton of dust and dirt and grime the whole way, flinging it onto all sorts of other vehicles. It just puffs up in clouds everywhere and tends to accumulate in all the nooks and crannies on a tank like this. I think sometimes scale modelers can have a tendency to overdo the wet mud effects on vehicles. Don't get me wrong, sometimes that happens when you're driving through particularly mucky areas, but in general, these vehicles on the move would just be really dusty, have some wet splashes on them, and particularly a lot of rain streaking. So what we're gonna focus on today are those general techniques: dust, a lot of pigment work, and some water streaking. So I'm gonna walk you through how I approach all those techniques on the 135 scale Churchill that I've been working on. You can see some other videos where I've been building and painting that along the way. And we're gonna use some pigments and some other effects to really mess this thing up. Make sure you stick around to the end for a secret technique that I like to use for wet effects. I haven't seen any other scale modelers do this on YouTube, so stay tuned. All right, with all that said, let's get into it. All right, guys, so here's our 135 scale Tamiya Churchill tank. It's pretty clean right now. I did a pin wash and some weathering on the nets and tarps in a previous video. You can check that out here. But other than that, I haven't done any pigment work, any streaking or any of that, so we're gonna focus on that right now. Let's pop the turret off so we can handle the vehicle from the turret ring. First step here, we're gonna be using some AMMO MiG Wet Mud. I know in the intro I said that these vehicles wouldn't have a lot of accumulated wet mud. This is gonna be a really light technique on the lowest parts of the vehicle, and it's really just trying to build up texture here. You'll see what I mean as we keep going. I'm using a junky old stiff bristle brush here. It's my tried and true for weathering stuff like this. Don't use one of your good ones because this acrylic mud stuff gets right in the bristles here and kind of ruins it for painting purposes. So designate one as your weathering brush and use that for this stuff. You can see here the wet mud has a nice glossy effect. And again, it's only on the bottom parts of the running gear and the hull of the vehicle. I'm going back and adding a little extra mud to the drive sprocket here. That is one place where mud actually would accumulate. Just make sure you don't get it on the tips where the drive sprocket would be coming in contact with the actual tracks of the tank. Here I'm adding some wet mud to the lower glasses plate and the bottom of the vehicle. The name of the game here, think about gravity when you're doing this. If this is a real vehicle, big heavy wet mud isn't gonna jump all the way up and be on the top parts of the tank. It's not gonna be on the turret. It's only gonna be on the bottom. So think of this realistically. If you envision this as a real vehicle, this is where the mud is going to accumulate, on the lowest parts of the tank. We're also going to put a little bit of wet mud in between the individual track links. This is mostly going to serve as a texture element for later, but if you think about it again, realistically, if a big heavy tank's driving through a field, bits of mud and dirt are going to get stuck in between those track links. So we're trying to replicate that effect. All right, next we're going to be moving on to some dried splash effects. I'm using AMMO MiG's dried earth splash effect here. Unfortunately, I didn't seal the bottle last time I used it, so it dried out on me. I had to use a little thinner to wake it up again, but this is good stuff if you pick it up and it's new and you actually take care of it. So we're going to load up a stiff bristled brush here with some of that splash product, wipe most of it off on a paper towel, and then as you see here, you kind of flick it on the lowest parts of the vehicle. Again, you want to make sure you're doing this from a low angle, as if you were on the ground and the splashes were hopping up onto the side of the vehicle as it was moving through the countryside. Once again, to achieve realistic effects here, we have to pay attention to gravity. We're trying to replicate real world effects. So mud here, it's going to be on the ground and it's going to splash up onto the side of our tank. So we're going to hold the model at a low angle and we're going to apply these effects from the bottom up. All right, with that subtle base of wet effects done, we're going to move on to some pigment work. I'm using AMMO MiG's Winter Soil here, but what we're gonna want to do is use a few different pigment colors. I'm starting with the darkest one that I have, and I'm gonna apply this to the lowest parts of the hull. This application process is as simple as it looks. I'm just using a dry brush, I'm loading it up with some of the pigment, and I am putting that right onto the vehicle itself. The only thing that's holding it there is this angle that I've got the tank at. It's just gravity. It's clinging onto the side of the model. This is a pretty flexible technique, but general rule of thumb, go a little lighter than you might expect. You can always add more afterwards, but it's kind of hard to get off once it's actually on there because it is just dust. All right, now I'm gonna move on to my second pigment. This is AMMO MiG's Dark Earth. It's a little bit lighter than the last one I was using. We're just looking for a gradient effect here, so try and find a pigment that's a little bit lighter than the one that you used previously on the lowest parts of the tank. I'm using the exact same technique here. I'm just going along in a row right above that last strip that I did with the darkest pigment, and you can see there's a gradient here. So now we have a darker tone on the bottom of the vehicle and a slightly lighter tone in the middle. For this third one, I'm moving on to Europe Earth. This is also AMMO MiG pigment. It's a very light one, and I'm gonna do the exact same thing. I'm just gonna do this on top of the mid-tone we just did. You might be thinking to yourself here, this is a ridiculous amount of pigment, but trust me, stick with the process. A lot of this is gonna get knocked off with the sealant process we do next. This is really just to help achieve a gradient from darkest to lightest on the side of the vehicle. A lot of it's gonna blend, and you'll see how it turns out. Okay, now we're gonna grab some enamel thinner. This is my dirty bottle that I use for weathering. It's not a clean, pure one that I use for airbrushing, and that's important because we're gonna be going back and forth from this to the vehicle quite a bit. We're gonna load up our brush with the thinner here, and we're gonna gently touch this to the side of the tank where the pigments are. The pigments will almost immediately soak up the thinner, and that's gonna help them bond to the side of the tank. So here are all of our pigments soaked with the enamel thinner. Admittedly, this looks pretty rough right now. You gotta be patient, put the vehicle down, let it dry for about 24 hours, and then we're gonna come back and keep working. Okay, so 24 hours later, all of the enamel thinner is dried and our pigments have bonded to the side of the vehicle. So what we're gonna do now is start blending and knocking off the excess that we don't need. While we're doing this, as always, keep in mind real world examples. If this vehicle is driving around, long march through the countryside, the dirt and dust that accumulates on the side of the tank is going to be lightest and driest on the top, where it's the furthest away from the ground, and it's going to be darker and wetter, still containing some moisture, lower on the tank where it might be, splashing through the occasional puddle or moving through wet grass. While you're blending, use some of the pigment that's fallen off the side of the vehicle. It's just going to be a mess on your drop cloth here. And add some darker spots in the lighter areas, add some lighter spots in the darker areas. This is nature, this is real life. You're not just gonna have uniform stripes right across the vehicle. So try and mix it up and make it seem as natural and unplanned as possible. I won't talk through this whole piece, but we're gonna do the exact same technique on the other side of the tank, as well as the front and back of the hull. Now that the lower portions of the hull are complete, we're going to move on to the upper surfaces of the vehicle. The name of the game here is subtlety. There's never going to be a situation where the top of a tank is dirtier than the sides of a tank. That's just not how real life works. So what we're trying to achieve here are little bits of dust that are accumulating in crevices on the upper surfaces of the vehicle. Keep in mind our reference videos while you're doing this. While these vehicles are on the move, they kick up big clouds of dust. Eventually that dust is going to settle on the upper surfaces of the vehicle, and as the crew is operating the machine, is working on these surfaces, they're going to knock off the dust everywhere except for the recesses on the vehicle. So something like this Churchill tank works really well because it has a lot of nooks and crannies. That's where we want this dust to go. Once we have a nice variety of pigment work, we're going to use some of that enamel thinner again, and we're going to bond the pigment to the upper surfaces of the vehicle. We're going to use these same subtle effects on the turret of the tank, and the big thing to keep in mind here, the turret is the furthest thing away from the ground. It is going to be less dirty than the hull of the vehicle because it is by nature further away from the dirt and grime. Here is the upper part of our hull now that the enamel thinner has dried. You can already see the pigment technique is starting to work pretty well. We're just going to do some blending, knock off some of that excess, and I think things are going to look pretty good. All right, this is exactly what we're looking for. A nice coating of dust that's accumulated on that olive drab paint. This looks authentic, really loving it so far. Make sure you do some blending on the turret too. We want to get all that excess knocked off. All right, everybody, this is that super special sprues and bruise technique I was talking about. We're going to be using high gloss Mod Podge here. If you haven't used Mod Podge before, it's just a basic arts and crafts adhesive. This stuff dries really nicely with a pretty high sheen, so it's perfect for scale modeling water effects. So try to picture here one of these tanks in combat conditions. They're out in the elements. Inevitably, they're going to get rained on, drizzled on. Who knows? The commander might spill his canteen and it runs down the side of the turret and off the vehicle. In any case, this wet metal is immediately going to get covered in dust again when these tanks are on the move. As we've said, they're constantly kicking up dirt and grime. And what we're trying to simulate here is that area of the tank, that wet metal that's just been covered in a new layer of dust. So what we'll do with the Mod Podge is use a nice fine tip brush, and we're going to put that in streaking patterns on the side of the vehicle. Again, keep in mind gravity. We're going to start from the top to the bottom, try and think of how water would flow off these tanks. Use reference photos, that can be really helpful. And this stuff is great because it's white when you put it on the vehicle, but it's going to dry clear. It's a good idea to match up the turret to the hull while you're doing this, because if you have a wet streak that's running down from the turret, you logically need to have that wet streak continue on the hull of the vehicle. After the Mod Podge is dried, which usually only takes a couple of minutes, use that blending brush that we had for the pigment phase and just gently brush over the top of the streak you just made. You don't have to pick up any new pigment, just use what's on the vehicle, and it's going to gently knock down that highest sheen that comes from the Mod Podge. And with that, we've got a nice dusty tank that looks like it's been in the field for weeks. There are infinite different weathering techniques you can use on a tank like this, but I think this pigment-heavy approach does a really good job of replicating that dry, dusty effect that you would see on these vehicles in spring-summer 44 in Northern Europe. If you enjoyed this video and got something out of it, please hit that like button. It really helps grow the channel. If you haven't done so already, you can subscribe for more scale modeling content. I try and post something new at least once a week. That is all I've got for today, so until next time, happy building, be well. Cheers, friends.